Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Preeta Bhattacharya, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we'll be talking about the social and cultural history of ancient India, and this module deals with the many facets of Mauryan culture. Today our learning objectives are to understand the significance of Mauryan period, its social and cultural developments. We are also dealing with the sources for the study of cultural history. We'll be talking about the religious developments, taking into account the Brahminical, Buddhist, Jain and Ajivik religions. We'll also be talking about the new concept introduced by Ashok, Dhammo of Ashoka. We'll be talking about the developments in learning and literature, and last but not the least, we'll be dealing with art and architecture which developed in the Mauryan period. At the very outset, we have to understand that the emergence of the Mauryan Empire in 4th century BCE ushered in a completely new notion of the state and a new kind of material culture based on an expanding agrarian resource base. Along with the new strategies of territorial control, the idea of empire also articulate domination over people who were regarded as culturally different. Empires of the ancient world are often thought to have operated through the violence of conquest and ideological persuasion which sought to bring about a semblance of cultural uniformity. However, the methods of conquest and reactions to it varied, and disparities of cultural expressions always persisted during this period. The variations within the Mauryan Empire were immense, and it continued into the later periods. Ecologies varied from region to region, as did patterns of living, languages and forms of worship. This is evident from the textual sources as well as from the archaeological profile of the period that we'll deal with today. One of the major sources considered for the Mauryan period is of course the Arthashastra, but the date of the Arthashastra has been debated, and some of the scholars place it in a later period. But we can be certain that some portions of the text go back to the Mauryan period. The problem is the text Arthashastra does not contain any reference to the Mauryas or the existence of an empire or the names of the Mauryan rulers. Another very major source which can be pinned down to the Mauryan period is the Indica, written by the Greek envoy Megasthenes. The book itself is completely lost, but large extracts from the books are preserved in later works of Greek and Latin authors like Diodorus, Strabo, Arrian and Pliny, to name a few. Since these texts sought to attract the educated Greek audience with sensational details, they left out bits which are considered boring. This is the problem with the text. The other problem is their narrative also vary according to the interest, interpretation and style of respective authors. Other literary sources can be enumerated which refer back to the Mauryan period. The Puranas give the king's lists. Mudra Rakshasa, a dramatic work, is also based on events taking place in the Mauryan period. We have the Sri Lankan Chronicle, Mahavangsha. Fajian and Xuanzang's accounts also refer to the period of Ashoka. The literary sources have been corroborated by archaeological evidence. the most important form of evidence that we have from the archaeological side are, of course, the inscriptions of Ashoka. By nature, the inscriptions of Ashoka can be divided into two categories. One are edicts which are related to Buddhism, and second are the edicts which propagate Dhamma. Most of the inscriptions are in the Prakrit language, and the Brahmi script has been used. Only two inscriptions in the northwest are in the Prakrit language, and the Kharoshthi script has been used. There are a few inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic as well. These are some of the specimens of the famous minor rock edicts of Ashoka recovered from Rupnath and Sannati. Some of the major rock edicts are also visible from Girnar, Yeragudi, and from the Girnar hills near Junagadh. We also have some sites which have been associated with the Mauryan level. Mostly these sites are the northern black polished ware sites of the Ganga valley. Archaeological remains from Kumrahar and Bulandibagh are associated with the Mauryan capital Pataliputra. Other important sites, of course, include Taxila, Mathura, Kosambi, and Vita, to name a few. Another important archaeological evidence is, of course, numismatic evidence. Punch-marked coins, mostly of silver, continued to be issued and circulated during the Maurya period. Some symbols on the coins have been specifically associated with the Mauryas. These are some of the specimens, some silver punch-marked coins that have been retrieved. These are some of the archaeological sites which have been associated with the Emperor Ashoka. The Sanchi Stupa, as you know, was first started by Ashoka. This is the Sarnath lion capital, which is presently the national emblem of India. And these are some of the freestanding pillars which probably were erected by Ashoka. Now let's move on to the new religious milieu, the specific changes in the religious spectrum that occurred during the Mauryan period. The new religious milieu is typified by the fact that several contending religious sects were coexisting in the Mauryan period. This is very evident from the rock edicts of Ashoka. In Rock Edict 13, Ashoka states that there is no region where there are no Brahmanas and Shramanas who are not attached to one Pasanda or another. In Rock Edict 7, the term Pasanda crops up again. Here, the term Pasanda is expressly concerned with the Buddhist Sangha, Brahmanas, Ajivikas, and Jains. In the Pali text of the Buddhist, the term Pasanda is again visible. This time, it also has a condemnatory tone, and it is being applied to Brahmanas and other non-Buddhist sects. We go back again to Ashoka Rock Edict 12, which seeks to address the coexistence of contending religions. This was apparently a novel situation for which the language itself was unprepared. That is why the term Pasanda crops up again and again in various contexts. Now we'll discuss the specific changes taking place within the Brahminical system itself. The first thing that strikes us when we look at the Brahminical practices of the period are that the element of ahimsa or non-violence is becoming more and more prominent in the Brahminical milieu also, within the Brahminical context. The other thing that is very important is that along with the Vedic rites, the Brahminical system was also focusing more and more on magical rites and rituals which are specifically connected with the Atharva Veda. Another important change is, of course, the surfacing of the notion of bhakti. It was still in a very nebulous state, and we have only a few clues that a kind of personal devotion to the god was on the rise. It is exemplified in the Arthashastra, where the name Krishna occurs, but it has not been specifically connected to the notion of devotion. Perhaps in Panini's Ashtadhyayi, a reference to Vasudeva and Arjuna as being worshipped, as receiving reverence, has some glimmerings of the concept of bhakti. The concept of bhakti later developed in the post-Mauryan period, and this is exemplified in the Heliodorus column at Besnagar near Sanchi, where the donor describes himself as Bhagavata. We also have references to temples, and temples which were wealthy and influential. The Arthashastra is the prime source as far as the temples are concerned. The Arthashastra, however, advises a needy prince to rob the wealth of temples whenever it was expedient. Archaeologically, a pillared hall in Bhir Mound of Taxila had been identified by John Marshall as a possible temple structure. Along with the institutionalized, organized religion, we have a substratum of popular beliefs, and the traces of popular beliefs are found in the number of terracotta figurines that have been recovered from the Mauryan levels at several sites. Sites like Taxila, Ahichatra, Song, Kosambi, Rajghat, etc. yield up a plethora of such figurines which have been described as figurines of the mother goddess. Reference to superstitious rituals are also found in the Ashokan edicts, and we have references to rituals which were performed during illnesses, during childbirth, or on the onset of a journey, and so on and so forth. Apart from Brahminical practices, Buddhism became one of the major religions in the Mauryan period, and it was given the pride of place in the Ashokan edicts. Ashoka's Pillar Edict 7 gives both the Buddhist Sangha much importance. The Sangha or Buddhist monastic order is mentioned in some of the minor rock edicts, and of course in the Schism Edict. The Ruminde Edict uses the name Lumbini for Buddha's birthplace, which agrees with the Buddhist tradition. The Nigalisagar Edict describes the building of a stupa, and from this source we can ascertain that stupa building was an established practice. Jainism was a religion that developed quite intensely during the Mauryan period, particularly during the rule of Chandragupta Maurya. But Ashoka also gives due respect to the Nirgranthas among the sects receiving his patronage, and we know that this term Nirgrantha has been specifically associated with the Jains. According to a tradition of the Shvetambara sect, Chandragupta Maurya is also associated with Jainism, and it is said that after a grave famine that occurred in Magadha, a number of Jain monks migrated to Karnataka. We have references to Ajivik practices from Ashoka's pillar edicts, but also we have two caves in the Barabar hills near Gaya, where Ashoka had donated some caves to the Ajivika sect. Later on, we have Ashoka's grandson Dasharatha, who donated 3 caves in the neighborhood in the Nagarjuni hills. This is the Barabar hills, which had been donated by Ashoka. The notion of Dhamma, which is an innovation of Ashoka, cannot be related to any kind of organized religion. This was a discourse on social ethics and sought to weld together the divergent forces of society and give people a common focus and a sense of unity. The most important facets of Ashoka's notion of dharma is, of course, the spirit of tolerance, where it has been stressed that tolerance between people and also between people's beliefs and ideas are especially important. Non-violence is, of course, another fundamental principle of Ashokan Dhamma. Now, from the religious domain, let's move on to the domain of learning and literature. The Mauryan period marks a very important phase in the protracted transition from orality to literacy. Of course, you must be aware that the question of literacy is bound up with the question of the origin of the Brahmi script. Apart from the Ashokan edicts, we have the Mahasthan and Sogora plaques, which roughly corresponds to the Mauryan period, and it records how official matters were carried out through written documents. Another interesting example would be the Jogimara cave inscription, which attests the fact that literacy permeated day-to-day life in the Mauryan period. This is the Jogimara cave inscription. The question of literacy is bound up with the question of languages. The bulk of the surviving inscriptions from the Mauryan period are in Prakrit, but there is also evidence of Aramaic and Greek inscriptions in the Ashokan corpus. During the Mauryan times, Tamil language with its distinct grammar and vocabulary emerged in the southern part of India. In the field of learning, we have the monumental work of Panini, Ashtadhyayi, but it has been placed much earlier than the Mauryan period. Panini's work was subjected to important re-examination by Katyayana, who can be placed in the Mauryan period. He composed critical glosses on Ashtadhyayi. Of course, Patanjali's Mahabhashya comes later. In the science of polity, Arthashastra is the major work that we have to consider, and we can be certain that the text was completed around 300 CE, but some portions of the text surely go back to the Mauryan period. In the domain of medicine, we have scanty references, but still we can talk about Patanjali, who mentioned the Vaidyakas as established practitioners. In Ashoka's Rock Edict 2, we have reference to treatment of human beings and cattle, and also discussions and descriptions of medicinal herbs. In mathematics, we have the Shulva Shastra texts which are concerned with the construction of baked brick fire altars. These texts can be pinned down to the Mauryan period. In the sphere of astronomy, Vedanga Jyotish, which probably represents the state of knowledge or belief on astronomical and calendarical matters before 200 BCE, could be roughly put in the Mauryan context. In literature, we can probably assume that the compilation of the epic Mahabharata was intensified during the Mauryan period. In Prakrit, of course, we have the specimens from Ashokan edicts, but these are very simple texts executed in a conversational style and are shorn of hyperboles. As for the Buddhist texts, we know that much of the Buddhist texts were beginning to take shape prior to the Mauryan period, but some segments of the Khuddaka Nikaya, especially the stories contained in the Jataka book, were probably being compiled during the Mauryan period. In the domain of art and architecture, the Mauryan period saw remarkable degree of innovation and change. In the field of art and architecture, the most visible symbols are the freestanding pillars of Ashoka, which are found all over the Gangetic basin. Just to gloss over a few of the features of the Ashokan pillars, we can say that they are monoliths because their shafts were originally of single blocks of stones. They are invariably circular, of great length, and mildly tapering towards the top. The pillars were finished with a lustrous polish, which is typical of the Mauryan age. The mention of the pillars has been made in Ashokan edicts themselves. In Ashokan edict, pillar edict number 7, Ashoka had talked about setting up of Dhamma pillars, and he specifically talks about the Rumindi pillar which he had installed. Talking about the development in stone sculptures, the major achievements are to be seen in the capitals of the Ashokan pillars. The animals in relief on the abacus rings include the lion, the elephant, horse, the Bactrian camel, the bull, and wild geese. Apart from them, there are decorative floral motifs. Besides the animals of the capitals, on the capitals, there is the very interesting life-size elephant cut in rock at Thauli. Niharanjan Ray sees steady progress from each stage in the execution of the lion taken apart from the other images. From Kalua to Loria Nandangarh and finally Rampurva, and the climax had been reached in the celebrated pillars of the Sarnath lions. One typical feature of the sculptural art of the Mauryan period is that the human figure is relatively absent. This is remarkable because during the later phase we see the exuberance of human figures. From this period we also have the striking yakshi of Didarganj, which has been executed in the round. It is a three-dimensional figure and it has the lustrous Mauryan polish. Here we have the lions of Sarnath and the Chauri bearer at the Yakshi from Didarganj. Apart from the specimens of courtly art, we also find numerous terracotta figures. Many terracotta figures were undoubtedly manually shaped with applique techniques to decorate them, but some were cast from terracotta matrices, as is illustrated from many copies of one plaque which bears the figure of a man. To sum up what we have discussed so far, we can highlight quite a few points. Firstly, the Mauryan period saw the establishment of a far-flung empire cutting across divergent cultural articulations. Secondly, the contacts with northern and western fringes of the empire highlighted the cosmopolitan character of the realm. The imperial power of the Mauryas was reflected in the realm of language and writing, and as well in the monumental sculptures and structures. Further, a drive towards cultural unification was perceived on the ideational plane of art and belief, as well as on the tangible symbols of authority. Even so, we can be sure that there were many cultural artifacts that express popular art, aesthetics and religious practices. For further information, you can visit ePathshala